Let's head out right now to the HR&P guest line and bring on someone that could give us the absolute latest involving Deshaun Watson and the legal situation. Mike Meltser joins us now. He's an attorney with a law degree from the University of Houston. He's covered the Houston Texans and has lived here in Houston for over a decade and now does national radio on Mad Dog Sports Radio on Sirius XM. Mike, really appreciate the time, man. We were reading some of your tweets about the hearing on the air earlier, so glad we could get you on the show. Thanks for being with us.
Guys, always good to be on with you. How are you guys?
Fantastic, Mike. So give us the absolute latest here. What exactly happened today with Deshaun Watson at this hearing?
So it's hard to kind of sum up in one or two sentences, but I would say the question on why we are here is basically a kind of complicated timing situation that we have. So as everybody knows by this point, Deshaun Watson is being sued by 22 accusers for various forms of sexual assault. And simultaneously, we have a criminal investigation that's been happening, and there's apparently a grand jury that has been convened partially on this issue. And so I think because there are two things happening at once, these civil cases and the criminal investigation, I think that's the reason why we had this hearing today, and I'll kind of explain that. So in the discovery process, which basically means that these parties that's the part of a civil case where both parties are sharing information, whether it's answers to written questions, documents, depositions. That's what discovery is, right? And so it seems like 8 or 9 months ago, these parties, Deshaun Watson's side and then Tony Buzbee, the attorney for all 22 accusers, they agreed on a set of deadlines. And one of the things that they agreed on was, here's how this would work. This is 22 cases that have been kind of confined into one, essentially. So you have a lot of parties. And so how is this discovery going to go in a way that makes sense? And what they agreed to about 8 or 9 months ago is that all of the accusers, all the plaintiffs would sit down for their depositions, and then, and only at that point, would Deshaun Watson then sit down for his deposition. So in terms of like a flow of information, you would have their entire side of the story before he sat down under oath. But the problem that they ran into, I suppose, is that, so there are 22 accusers, and I believe 6 of them have not sat for their deposition. That's what came out today. So 6 of them, of the 22. And so what Rusty Hardin, who is Deshaun's attorney, what he wanted is to say, okay, these 6 have not even taken their deposition. And oh, by the way, there's a criminal investigation ongoing. And so we don't think it's appropriate for Deshaun to have to sit for his deposition until the criminal matter is resolved, and those 6 have to sit for their deposition. That's what brought us to the hearing earlier this afternoon.
Mike, the emphasis from Rusty Hardin on news coming from the criminal side, you mentioned sort of the reason why he would want to emphasize the criminal stuff. That's seemingly been a more recent emphasis as far as the public conversation about this case. What do you make of Rusty Hardin, Deshaun Watson's attorney, saying that he expects something on April 1st? How likely do you think that we're going to get some clarity from the criminal side on April 1st? And what happens if there is no clarity by April 1st?
Well, that, by the way, that last question, Cody, that you asked is literally a question that the judge, Ravia Collier, asked Rusty Hardin's side today. But to kind of back up a little bit, I think this is the money part of today's hearing. I think this was the key part of it. And what Rusty Hardin is in kind of a tricky position in that he has a client, Deshaun Watson, who has these civil allegations against him while there's a criminal investigation ongoing. And the problem that he has is that anything that Deshaun says or anything that happens in this civil case can be used against him in a criminal proceeding. That is an issue. And that is an issue because if Deshaun Watson sits down for his deposition until there's some kind of resolution on the criminal front, then the things that Deshaun Watson says in his deposition could be used against him in determining, like, is there going to be a criminal charge? And so what Rusty Hardin was arguing was basically this. Hey, judge, if you make Deshaun Watson sit down for the deposition, then I'm going to tell him to plead the fifth. Because any attorney, in Rusty's words, would tell their client in the same situation to keep pleading the fifth for every question that is asked. And Rusty added, that's going to make Deshaun Watson look bad in the court of public opinion. What if he takes the fifth in a deposition for literally every single question for a couple of hours? It's released by Tony Busby on social media, as Tony tends to do. And then all of a sudden, a few weeks later, there are no criminal charges filed. How does Deshaun bounce back from that in the court of public opinion? That was, to me, kind of the crux of Rusty Hardin's argument today.
Mike, the original Deshaun deposition was supposed to take place this week, and well, one of the reasons why it's not taking place this week is because the depositions for the 22 accusers haven't been completed yet, which was the original plan. Why is that the case? Was that an intentional? Was that like a stall tactic maybe to not get those other depositions done? Was it scheduling issues? And what do you think that, or how do you think that impacts the overall outcome of this case?
Brad, I think that's a great question, and this is something that the judge asked, Rusty a couple of times, like, hey, you guys have had the opportunity to depose these, plaintiffs over the course of these last couple of months because, Rusty had argued earlier, like, hey, we want them to come to Houston. We want them to fly in. Once they do, we're happy to take their depositions. They're the ones suing Deshaun Watson. He's not suing them. They sued him in this jurisdiction. Therefore, they should have to come here. And I think the judge pointed out, you had a couple of options there, and you took none of them. And one of the options being just take the deposition over Zoom. That's what a lot of attorneys have been doing over the course of the last 2 years. Like, a lot of this stuff happens via Zoom. It seems like they opted not to do that. I think without, Brad, knowing the details of what scheduling issues there have been, I think it's hard for me to assess whether this was a delay tactic, and if it was, by which side it would be. I should also probably answer Cody, directly answer Cody's earlier question about the April 1st thing, because Rusty kept hammering April 1st. It's the way Rusty was talking today about the grand jury, his side being asked for information, by the grand jury, by the district attorney's office. I know Rusty worked for the DA's office for a long time, so he knows how those things work a lot better than I do. The way he talked about April 1st is he sounded like a guy who was pretty confident that on the criminal front, that April 1st would be the day by which we will know if charges are, or if Deshaun is indicted by the grand jury.
Mike Meltser is our guest. He's an attorney with a law degree from the University of Houston. You've heard his voice in this town doing radio for over 10 years. He's now a national host on Mad Dog Sports Radio, and he's joining us here on the Wheelhouse. Mike, what is the timeline now for how things move going forward? Like, when do you actually expect this litigation to finally come to its conclusion?
Well, let's talk about the timeline here. I'm going to try to simplify this, but this ruling is a little bit nuanced, all right, guys? So you can follow along here. I'll try to simplify this because I know this can be complicated. So here's the tricky thing right now is because Rusty Hardin was so focused on, hey, there's a criminal investigation going on, I don't want to have to tell my clients to plead the fifth, while that remains unresolved. We have 22 accusers, and those 22 accusers are in three different categories. Category number one is an accuser who did not file a criminal complaint who has been deposed. The judge's ruling on those plaintiffs was that they can proceed with Deshaun Watson's deposition. That's category one. Category two is accusers, plaintiffs who have filed criminal complaints who also have been deposed. The judge ruled today that they cannot proceed with the oral deposition of Deshaun Watson until April 1st. And then we have a third category of women who have not filed criminal complaints, the accusers, but who have also not been deposed. With that third kind of category, the judge ruled that they cannot proceed with the deposition of Deshaun until they themselves first be deposed. So I think that makes some sense. There are three different categories of accusers. As far as litigation, I think, your guess is as good as mine. I think today was not a win for Deshaun in court because technically when Rusty Hardin's available, which it sounds like it's not this week, it's not next week because he's got I think he's in trial on something else. But in 2 weeks, it sounds like Deshaun's deposition could go forward, which might provide some leverage for the Tony Busby side to get a settlement on at least some of these cases before that takes place.
Mike, What happens if April 1st shows up and there's no indictment on criminal charges for Deshaun Watson?
Well, that's the thing. When it comes to criminal matters, and I don't do criminal defense because I don't want people's, lives in my hands. That's not something I would desire. So, it's all, and this I think would cut against Rusty Hardin's argument a little bit because, put it this way, I have a friend of mine who is an attorney in the Philadelphia area, and his office was the one that I think ultimately took up the case against Bill Cosby. I think that case derived from things that happened in civil litigation. So what Rusty Hardin says, hey, listen, just wait until April 1st and everything's going to be resolved. Technically, that stuff is never completely fully resolved because what if the grand jury chooses not to indict, Deshaun goes ahead with the deposition, and there's information that's revealed in that deposition? It's not like the DA's office or a new grand jury can't indict him moving forward. So the criminal stuff is never really completely put to bed. I think that's a really tricky part of it.
Mike, last thing before we let you go, what's sort of the best case scenario timeline for the Texans? Just keeping this from a Texans perspective, trying to get this thing resolved so they could trade Deshaun Watson somewhere else. When this thing unfolds, what would be the best case scenario for the Texans moving forward?
I think the best case scenario is tomorrow Deshaun settles all 22 cases, and there is some news that there will be no criminal charges, no felonies, no misdemeanors. If that happens tomorrow, that would be the best case scenario for the Texans. I think it's really that simple. Now, I don't think it's going to happen in that exact way, but I do think from Deshaun's standpoint, and I haven't really seen a lot of reporting about this specific point, and it kind of puzzles me, but it does appear to me that there has not been a whole lack of urgency on the Watson side to kind of make progress. And one thing I wonder about, and I don't know what you guys think about this, but we all remember the report around the trade deadline that Stephen Ross, the owner of the Dolphins, was pushing Watson to settle these cases. That's the report. And apparently Watson came close to settling 18 of 22, but there were 4 holdouts. What I wonder, without knowing the exact details on it, and the lawyers obviously do, but why didn't he actually settle 18 of those? Because I feel like as far as other NFL teams go, if there was progress made in Deshaun's legal situation, that 18 of these cases would be gone. He was just focusing on the 4 and the criminal investigation, then I think that would reflect at least some level of progress, whereas it doesn't seem like we're at that point right now. So that puzzles me.
Mike, we really appreciate the time, man. Great job covering the story today, and we'll definitely get you on again soon.
Jake, Cody, Brad, thank you so much.
Mike Meltser on the HR&P guest line. Follow him on Twitter. He's been live tweeting the Deshaun Watson legal situation throughout at Mike Meltser. Listen to him on Mad Dog Sports Radio. And, of course, he's got a law degree from the University of Houston.